Hi, my name is Steve Kennard. I'm the Director of Bitcoin Mining Analytics at the Texas Blockchain Council, and thank you for your time and your interest in Bitcoin mining and this introduction to Bitcoin mining. I'd like to start and take a little bit of time to introduce myself and really take you through the journey of how I got to be so interested in this and why I believe, and this presentation hopefully will support, that Bitcoin mining is really of interest to everybody. It's something that all of us can benefit from understanding and has tremendous promise for society. My interest in Bitcoin mining started a couple of years ago, towards the beginning of 2020. And really, I had been an energy professional by background. I had been involved in starting an oil and gas company in Houston, and I had moved to Dallas to work in oil and gas banking. And in my prior experience, I had direct exposure to an oil and gas operation in which there was stranded energy, stranded natural gas that couldn't get to market, and as a result was just burned off. It was flared and completely lost. And that always stuck with me as an intractable problem that the oil and gas industry faces, and something that really all of us can recognize as an issue we would desire to resolve and always use our energy as efficiently as possible. I don't quite remember how, but at some point I heard about Bitcoin mining in the oil field. And I'll admit, when I first heard that, I was extremely skeptical. If not, frankly, I thought it was a ridiculous scam. And I was really only interested from the standpoint of understanding whether or not it could solve the problem of stranded energy that I had encountered in my own life. At the same time, I had increasingly more free time. Thankfully, it was a way to engage myself during the time of the pandemic in 2020, when many of us were at home and had more time as well. And the reason I bring that up is I don't think I would have been able to convince myself of the importance of this technology if I hadn't have had the free time required to study it, because I was so skeptical. And so I understand why so many people who perhaps don't understand Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, or start from a skeptical point of view, have really never come to appreciate it, because I myself had that same position that I went through. Over the course of 2 years, I continued to study Bitcoin and really slowly but surely started to realize that it was a transformational technology and not only solved the problem of stranded energy, but really would bring hope to many people that suffer from an inability to access financial services and from the inflation that plagues so many government currencies around the world. And so with that, I slowly but surely started to feel that I should spend more and more time studying this technology. And after 2 years, decided to make a career change to focus on this full time. The reason, again, that I begin with this story is really to appeal to people that have heard about Bitcoin mining and dismissed it. Often, I've seen headlines that describe it as computers performing complicated math problems. I'll be the first to admit that that sounds ridiculous. Frankly, using energy to just perform complicated math problems is wasteful and absurd, and we should oppose that. And so we really have to spend a little bit of time to understand the nature of that energy consumption, the value that it provides, and where it finds itself in the value chain of energy. Another item that I struggled with in my 2 years of kind of grappling with the importance of Bitcoin is whether or not it was even real, the concept that it will simply be banned or it'll be hacked and it will disappear. And this is in fact the critical issue that Bitcoin mining seeks to resolve. I'll be the first to admit I spent months really just thinking that at any moment Bitcoin would disappear, that it was just a passing fad. And so I understand that concern that many people have. I hope this presentation will serve as a resource. Ultimately, I hope that it will help some of you spend less than 2 years to come to the realization that all of us have a stake in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is for everyone, and it provides tremendous value to society. And while I do not intend to give financial advice, and I certainly don't think that we should require anybody to use Bitcoin, it is something that we should all endeavor to understand. And we should not just accept living in willful ignorance. So under that spirit, I'd like to begin. As a starting point, I think it's most helpful to go straight to the source. That is the Bitcoin white paper, the initial document that was published in 2008 by a pseudonymous person or persons that used the name Satoshi Nakamoto. It's always better to start with the white paper and reference it, since there's so many headlines that can be misleading. And for that reason, I'd like to read the introduction. Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. A purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. Digital signatures provide part of the solution, but the main benefits are lost if a trusted third party is still required to prevent double spending. We propose a solution to the double spending problem using a peer-to-peer network. I think there's a couple of interesting aspects that come to light here in the introduction of the white paper. The first is it's a pretty direct way to tell us and answer the question that many of us struggle with. What is Bitcoin? Well, Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Of course, we've all in our daily lives dealt with cash. It's not anything foreign to us, at least for the past couple of decades. And one of the most important aspects of cash is that you can hold it, just like I am now. It's a bearer asset. Whoever has it in their hands controls that asset and can, with a high level of confidence, verify that they are in fact holding it. So what that allows us to do is to engage in peer-to-peer transactions, which we've all done before. You simply hand cash to another individual, and there you go. The transaction is complete. However, you have to be physically next to each other, and you both have to agree to the unit of exchange. And so that introduces something that's really universal within the financial industry, which is assessing counterparty and intermediary risk. This is really at the center of the problem that Bitcoin is seeking to solve, that issue of allowing people to interact and transact peer-to-peer through this network. And in order to do that, we have to seek to eliminate that counterparty risk, to eliminate any intermediary that could censor participants, or in the words of this introduction, introduce double spending that would essentially be fraudulent transactions. So with that kind of framework and foundation of what Bitcoin is, a peer-to-peer network, I'd like to spend some time going through some of the important aspects that are typically assigned to money, a unit of account, just like this dollar that I'm holding here. The picture on this slide is something that I've found to be very useful as a framework to understand and to talk about this, and I'll credit Fidelity Digital Assets with coming up with this very useful graphic. My desire is less to impose that you agree or disagree with what it's representing, but rather spend some time walking through the framework, the different components that make up an effective peer-to-peer transaction. And let's just contemplate that and use it as a way to think about the utility, the validity, and ultimately the value of what Bitcoin can offer. And so what you have here is 3 columns for the most widely recognized or popular methods by which people can transact. Of course, historically, we've had gold. It's been around for millennia. Bitcoin is the middle column there, which is our focus today. And then most widely recognized in our common society is fiat currency, the dollar. A fiat currency is simply a currency that derives its utility through the declaration of the government, and the word fiat meaning a declaration in Latin. And so that's what fiat currency means. But for the purposes of this discussion, we can just think of it as the dollar. And so the first concept that's presented here is durability, whether a unit of account is durable. Of course, gold is very durable. Even if it's melted down, it can never be broken down beyond gold itself. It's a universal element, and it's proven that over millennia. So we can expect that there would be universal alignment around gold being durable. Bitcoin presents an interesting way to look at what does it mean to be durable. I think as we begin to interact more with the function of mining in Bitcoin, it becomes more and more apparent that it is in fact very durable through its decentralization and no single point of failure. And so it's important to dig into that concept more to appreciate the durability. Fiat currency, however, over time has not proven to be durable, as in fact it's designed to lose value through what we call inflation. And so that's really a central issue that we've all experienced, and is an important differentiator when we think about the unit of account that we choose to transact in our day-to-day lives. The next item that we can look at is divisible. Again, this is a critical component of an effective unit of account for use in transacting. And it's been a central struggle of using gold and silver and really any hard metal. The only way to really make it more divisible is to melt it down, which requires time and equipment, and also introduces the risk of counterfeiting anytime that you're melting something down. And so that's been a central challenge over the decades with using gold as money, and ultimately was part of why fiat currency proved to be more useful. Of course, it's easily divisible. And if new units of account within that fiat currency need to be created, it's as easy as the government declaring that there'll be a new $200 or $300 bill if we determine that to be required. Bitcoin is tremendously divisible. There's a fixed supply of 21 million Bitcoin, but what people don't often understand is that each individual Bitcoin, those 21 million, are divisible into 100 million Satoshis. The Satoshi is the smallest unit of account within the Bitcoin network. And a Satoshi today's value is a fraction of 1 cent. And so that level of divisibility is really compelling and fairly unique. The next concept laid out in this framework is fungible. So this really refers to the recognition across borders or across different industries or cultures of something in terms of its use of as a unit of account. Gold has really always been fungible. All cultures have recognized the value of gold. That's been shown to be true in many different cultures around the world. On the fiat currency side, fungibility has always been a challenge. And of course, many of us have experienced this. If you travel to a foreign country, you have to go to a foreign exchange counter, you incur fees. There's a lot of friction around that. And often it can be difficult to understand what you're doing if it's in a different currency. And so that is a challenge that the current fiat system faces. Bitcoin proposes really a great opportunity to increase fungibility in that there is no central Bitcoin market. It's a 24/7, 365 days a year market. There is no authority that determines an exchange rate. And over time, many different companies and market makers have risen to provide the services of making Bitcoin fungible, that is, convertible to other units of account like the US dollar or the euro or whatever it may be. And increasingly, there's less and less friction to do so, since Bitcoin is a global, decentralized unit of account. The next item on the list here is portable. And this is really obviously one of the great struggles of gold. It's heavy. If you have ever held a gold bar, it's heavy, and beyond that, and in the act of trying to move gold, you incur tremendous risk. And of course, over centuries, that was the central reason that so many pirates emerged, is you would have people having to send gold and treasure across the ocean, and it created tremendous risk. And that risk is still with us today. I mean, anytime you see a Brinks armored truck driving down the street. And so to the degree that a unit of account is portable, it can be more widely adopted. Fiat currency has enjoyed a lot of adoption because it is a lot more portable than gold. And one of the main reasons that paper money was created centuries ago was as a paper representation of gold deposits, precisely so that it could be more portable, more easily used in international commerce. And that makes perfect sense. Bitcoin is a digitally native asset, and a peer-to-peer network is the most portable option that we really have today. Really, one of the central reasons that it exists is to solve that problem of the portability that gold struggled with. The next item on the list is verifiable. And again, I'd already mentioned the struggles of gold. There have been many accounts of counterfeiting gold, or entities claiming that they hold gold in reserve that they don't hold in reserve, because the only way you can verify at the end of the day is for you personally to be present when the gold is melted down. That is really the way to eliminate a counterparty risk in a gold denominated system. Fiat currencies have struggled widely with counterfeiting. That's a widely known problem. I myself have traveled through Latin America quite a bit, and I was the first-hand victim of a counterfeiting crime, and was most disappointed when I realized that I'd fallen for the trick, just because it was so convincing and it looked like the home currency of that country, and yet it was just a common practice that counterfeiters were able to copy that currency, and it made it very difficult to have any confidence in transacting with any particular individual. This is an area where Bitcoin shines. It's extremely inexpensive, open source, open to anybody to opt in to participate in the Bitcoin network. And once you hold your own private keys on the network, you can have a very high level of confidence that the Bitcoin that you are holding is in fact Bitcoin, and there's really no additional cost around verifying that. And that's really a tremendous advancement for freedom and to facilitate transacting in a digital economy. The next concept that we're going to cover is scarcity, whether or not a unit of account is scarce. This was where gold always shined, if I can use that term. We know that gold is scarce because over centuries, many people have tried to find more of it. I mean, that's the primary focus of gold miners, is to scour the earth and find more gold. And even when they do find more, we know with a high degree of certainty that it can only be extracted and refined with a lot of expended time and energy. And that cost of extracting the gold enforces a scarcity on its supply. And for that reason, gold over generations has been a remarkable store of value, and it derives that value at the end of the day more than anything else from that scarcity, and from the fact that any counterparty that you're interacting with can also believe that it is scarce. You don't have to explain to them how gold is scarce. Over time, people have come to believe that with a high degree of confidence. On the flip side, I don't think any of us would argue that fiat currencies have proven to be scarce. In fact, one of the primary reasons they are proposed by governments that oversee them is due to the ability for essentially costless supply to be added, what's typically referred to as the money printer. And in recent years, we've seen trillions of new US dollars come to market with really no end in sight. And so to say that any fiat currency is credibly scarce, I think, is a misunderstanding of what's at work in terms of policies around fiat currency. Scarcity is one of, if not the strongest value propositions of Bitcoin. In fact, until Bitcoin, perfect scarcity really didn't exist in the world. As I mentioned before, we can know that gold is scarce because of the difficulty of mining it. We know that it's under the earth, that it requires refining, it's heavy, and so that has enforced scarcity over millennia. But we don't know how much gold there is. People are always searching for more, and well, tomorrow at the bottom of the ocean or anywhere else, an enormous new supply of gold could be discovered. It's a remote risk, but it is there. This is where Bitcoin is really unique. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. That's verifiable in the code and easily seen by anybody. That's just simple mathematics at this point. And that's what I mean by perfect scarcity. It's the first time really in human history that we have perfect scarcity that's available to anyone equally, without preference to any certain class, country, or creed. And I think that's something that we have to keep a focus on as we continue to work towards a better understanding of Bitcoin. Is to say that Bitcoin has no value is to say that scarcity itself has no value. when in fact, over millennia, the relative scarcity of gold is precisely what gave it its value. And finally, and perhaps most challenging to talk about, is track record. This is, of course, a subjective word, but I think a useful one to think through. The track record of gold is really undeniable. Since the earliest human civilizations, gold has been recognized as a store of value. The track record of fiat currency is questionable in terms of its retention of that value, since all fiat currencies have materially lost value over time. However, in some degrees, they've been successful in the sense that they are widely adopted, have facilitated a lot of international trade, and of course, the prosperity of the United States has been advanced throughout the 20th century during a time when we were living under a fiat currency. Now, the ultimate challenges, or whether that was in spite of the fiat currency, I'll leave for another discussion. But at least Fidelity Digital Assets here, interestingly, under track record, marks a negative for fiat currency, and I would tend to agree with that. Bitcoin finds itself in kind of a no man's land, if I can call it that, in terms of track record. Of course, it is the youngest. It only came into existence in 2008, and much more recently than that became an object of mainstream discussion. However, an important thing to think about in terms of track record of Bitcoin, and this is really applicable as we get into Bitcoin mining, is that it is constantly being really refreshed and added to through the addition of new transactions and new blocks. In other words, it's verifiable by any of us that Bitcoin continues to function just as promised, with tremendous transparency. And in my opinion, a single year of Bitcoin proving that it can do that is worth a lot more than, in terms of overall track record, than other assets that have maybe been around for longer. And so I think it's a concept worth thinking about, that perhaps track record cannot simply be measured by time, but also by technological advancement and the transparency around whether or not an asset delivers what it purports to deliver. So with that, I'd like to shift towards a discussion of how does mining fit into all of this. And really, before I can advance with that, I have to address the word mining. I'll admit that I struggled with this as I started to study Bitcoin. Of course, mining immediately makes me think of a mine, a group of people with pickaxes digging in the earth. And of course, that's natural. I've interacted with numerous people that will ask me, where is the Bitcoin mine? Where are the Bitcoins, the actual physical thing that's extracted from the earth? This, of course, isn't the case, but I certainly understand why it would be confusing given the use of this word mining. And so I'd like to, again, refer back to the white paper. Let's go back to the source and look at the only time in the white paper when the word mining or miners is used. And I think it'll give us an additional context of how did we end up with this term. So reading from the white paper, the steady addition of a constant amount of new coins is analogous to gold miners expending resources to add gold to circulation. In our case, it is CPU time and electricity that is expended. So again, that's the only time that the white paper itself refers to miners. So the term really came into our vernacular just through common people talking about Bitcoin. However, I do think it's useful and probably a better term than timestampers or participants in the validation process, which are silly names and will probably only create more confusion. So I'll go ahead and stick with mining for now. But the way that the white paper describes this is useful and really goes back to the prior slide discussing how gold has been recognized for its scarcity for millennia because the mining of gold requires energy and time. It's difficult. And so in that same way, the introduction of new Bitcoin supply into existence also requires electricity, and as the white paper describes it, CPU time. And so it is an effective analogy that just as gold miners expend energy to bring new gold into circulation, Bitcoin miners expend energy to bring new Bitcoin into circulation. But they also do a lot more than that. And so I want to dig into that. There's a couple of new terms that I certainly struggled with in my long process to try to understand this, and I want to highlight a few of them, and perhaps this would be a resource to refer back to, because understanding these terms is really fundamental to having an appreciation for how mining works and why it's important. Those terms are Byzantine general's problem, cryptographic hash function, SHA-256, hash rate, proof of work, difficulty adjustment, block reward, and halving. By the end of this presentation, I hope all of those terms will be clearly defined and useful in expanding your understanding of Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. So let's start with the Byzantine generals problem. One might ask, what does a Byzantine problem have to do with Bitcoin, a digital currency? Well, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Bitcoin directly, but it's rather a reference to a game theory problem that has really plagued humanity for millennia, on back to Byzantine times. And the nature of the problem is, if we can imagine a scenario wherein a Byzantine general that's preparing to attempt to sack a city has numerous components of an army preparing and trying to coordinate an attack. The nature of the Byzantine general's problem is that you have numerous parties spread out, and in order to effectively attack the city and expect to win, they need to attack at the same time. They need to have consensus at any given moment about the moment they plan to launch that attack. So the Byzantine general's problem is, how can he be sure that all of his troops know exactly when to attack? This picture that I've used here, and I'll give credit to River Financial, is a useful representation of this. We have part of the cavalry. We can see the navy in the river there. On the other side of the river, it looks like some archery. So you have disparate members of an army trying to prepare to attack. And in the middle, you have the defenders that could try to intercept messages between them and falsely include information to thwart the efforts to collaborate. At the end of the day, this Byzantine general's problem represents the difficulty in having a single source of truth that can be trusted. It's the difficulty of consensus around what is right and what is false. And that doesn't just affect a Byzantine general or Bitcoin. It's a universal issue, really, that humans have grappled with. And of course, it manifests itself throughout the financial industry in counterparty risk. We have an entire ratings system that goes from AAA down to junk bonds. And the whole reason that that system exists is to facilitate external parties understanding their counterparty risk. This is really another way that the Byzantine general's problem manifests itself, meaning, how can we all know the state of any given company or counterparty that we're going to interact with? What can we trust? And the most difficult or challenging way that this manifests itself in our lives really is in money and transacting with other people, and in the intermediaries that we have to trust to facilitate those transactions across time and space. And so the Byzantine general's problem is just kind of a simple way to wrap that concept into a picture here and think about the struggle of determining without intermediaries, what we can trust and what we can't trust. So let's dive into cryptography. There's a lot of discussion and reference to Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency, or sometimes even just shortened to crypto. And it's a reasonable question to ask, well, what does that really even mean? Well, the root reason that Bitcoin is often referred to as a cryptocurrency is because it uses cryptography. That's not unique to Bitcoin. Cryptography has been around for a long time. So the secure hash algorithm 256, which I'll refer to here on as SHA-256, was developed by the U.S. National Security Agency, had nothing to do with Bitcoin, was published in 2001, well before Bitcoin, is readily available and widely used, and is referred to as SHA-256 because the output is a 256-bit hash value. Really, this is just a tool that can be used to encrypt any information. And what a cryptographic hash function like SHA-256 really does is it takes variable length inputs, any input, and it generates a fixed length output. It's a one-way function, meaning after that output is generated, it is easy to compute, and it is very difficult, or in the case of SHA-256, functionally impossible to reverse. And that is the nature, that is the value of the encryption of that information, is that it cannot be de-encrypted. And so if we look at the application of this in Bitcoin, I would encourage you to go and just look for a SHA-256 calculator. These are readily available. They're free online, and you can input any of the words that I'm about to use in my example and actually verify the SHA-256 output. Each output of SHA-256 is a hash. So when we refer to hash, we're referring to a string, a 256-bit string of letters and numbers, and that total amount of output is a hash rate. So let's look at a few examples, a SHA-256 demonstration. I'll start with the word Texas. You take the word Texas and put it into a SHA-256 calculator, and it will give this output, 4B95CE, and I won't read the whole thing, but you can see there. And what's interesting to note about it is there's really no way that one can easily look at that string of letters and numbers and say, I think that this might be one word, or I think it might start with a T. There's no patterns that are detectable there. Let's look at another example. We take the word Texas. The only thing we add to the end of it is an exclamation point. And what's important to note here is that the hash for Texas with an exclamation point is completely different than the hash for just the word Texas right above it. So rather than starting 4B95, we start DD53. And all the way through this string, this 256-bit hash, there's really no correlation whatsoever. And the first input has 5 letters. This one, of course, has 6 inputs, 5 letters and an exclamation point, and it's the same output. And so that's the nature of the encryption, is we cannot detect any patterns, and any output is completely different. So how does this apply to Bitcoin? I'd like to continue with this demonstration. Imagine if I were to tell you, I'd like you to take that first word, Texas, just as I've presented it here. You can add anything to it, anything, completely random. You must begin your input, though, with the word Texas, just as I've started here. And if you can find a hash value that begins with the letter A, I'll pay you $170,000. Would you be interested in attempting that? I think that you would, and that's precisely the incentive provided to Bitcoin miners. They come into the market and take information and hash it, seeking a reward in Bitcoin. Let's continue with the demonstration. I could start Texas forever. And we can see it starts with a 3, so we haven't found our match. Texas are Texas. Of course, that's our song for the state of Texas, but also doesn't meet the stipulated requirements. Texas is bigger than France, a true statement, but still doesn't meet our requirements. Texas A&M University. I'm a proud former student of Texas A&M, but this also doesn't meet our requirements. Throughout these different iterations of SHA-256, again, you can see each is completely different, the same length output, all starting with the same first word, and then a random sequence of letters in the input thereafter. Texas is Bitcoin country. We see the hash output here begins with the letter A. This was a winning entry. Not the only one. I'm sure there are others, but at least in this exercise, it's the first one that we've arrived to that meets the target that we stipulated at the beginning of the exercise. This, in a nutshell, is the Bitcoin mining process. The hash rate of the Bitcoin network has currently risen to 379 exahash per second. And I've represented that number here on this slide just so you can see how many zeros that is every second. So while you can go onto a free online SHA-256 calculator and perhaps hash a couple of times per second, imagine the amount of competition going on with 379 exahash. So how does this really compare to Bitcoin mining? The image in the center of the slide here, again, is from the white paper, and it represents a block within Bitcoin. What the block contains is important information for the network, the previous hash from the block before it, and the transactions. That's what the TX below the block represents. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do in Bitcoin is have a ledger that records all of the transactions that we can all verify independently in order to solve that Byzantine general's problem. And the next part here is perhaps the most important to understand, and that's the nonce. That's simply a random number. So think of our example. The input information was Texas. Texas here represents the different transactions that we're trying to verify and the previous hash from the last valid block, so that there's a constant connection and continuation of the Bitcoin network so that we can have a record of all valid transactions. The nonce was whatever we added to Texas. The winning nonce was, is Bitcoin country? Texas is Bitcoin country. So the is Bitcoin country part of that is our proof of work. This is what Bitcoin mining is all about, that proof of work. It's taking information that has value to us, our transactions that we want to validate, running it through the SHA-256 algorithm with a nonce, seeking to meet the target that the network establishes. So the difficulty refers to that relative probability of finding a value below the target. The network establishes a target by determining that there are a certain number of zeros that have to occur at the beginning of the hash output. So again, our target for our exercise was simply that the first letter in the output be A. It's a fairly easy target. Over time, difficulty on the Bitcoin network is adjusted through a difficulty adjustment that occurs every 2016 blocks, which is approximately every 2 weeks. And the goal or the reason for having that difficulty adjustment is to maintain a target block time of 10 minutes. So as the hash rate increases, as more people start to participate in the network and compete for the Bitcoin that is granted for each successful block, the difficulty adjustment increases the difficulty. It increases the number of zeros that must be at the beginning of that hash output. And this is an important way that we can trust the validation of transactions in the network. I'll get to that in a minute. So why are the miners doing this? What's the point? It's the block reward. The block reward has two components. The first is the subsidy. The subsidy is the way that new Bitcoin comes into circulation. So there's a chart here that usefully represents the function of the subsidy and the Bitcoin issuance schedule. At the beginning of the Bitcoin network, the subsidy was 50 Bitcoin per block. As we've mentioned before, Bitcoin is perfectly scarce. It's trending towards its final cap of 21 million total. And in order to enforce that, about every 4 years, there's a halving in that subsidy schedule. So we went from 50 to 25 to 12.5, and now we're at 6.25 Bitcoin for every block that is the Bitcoin subsidy. So any miner that can find the winning proof of work would receive that subsidy. The other component are the transaction fees, and I would describe transaction fees as really the last true free market that we have. It's anybody can participate in the Bitcoin network, and by participate I mean transact, send Bitcoin from one address to another. In any transaction, you of course have to determine how much Bitcoin you'll be sending, but the other component of that transaction is the transaction fee that you offer to the miners. If you offer more, you have a higher probability of having your transaction included in the next block. If you offer less, then of course you may have to wait longer. And the chart here shows the relative volatility of transaction fees as a percent of total block reward. And really, it's a representation of that free market. People are willing to pay more or less to get their transactions validated, depending on all kinds of external factors that influence this market, which again is a 24/7, 365-day-a-year market. And that's really the fairest and most transparent way to incentivize miners is to just let the users of the network determine that. And the combination of those transaction fees with the subsidy forms the total incentive that a miner has to contribute hash rate to this network. So I want to return now to the white paper. I read part of the introduction, the abstract earlier, and now I'd like to add a little bit more from that abstract and see if, in light of the concepts that have been discussed thus far, if this starts to make more sense around the function and why we need Bitcoin mining if we want a peer-to-peer network. A purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. Digital signatures provide part of the solution, but the main benefits are lost if a trusted third party is still required to prevent double spending. We propose a solution to the double spending problem using a peer-to-peer network. The network timestamps transactions by hashing them into an ongoing chain of hash-based proof of work, forming a record that cannot be changed without redoing the proof of work. So the most important concept added here is proof of work. That's what we've been trying to understand through the demonstrations of the past couple of slides, what that proof of work means and how we can be sure that it did in fact require work. Well, again, we can refer back to the 379 exahash of hash rate on the network. If a miner can present a valid proof of work, meaning the combination of transactions in a block with a nonce that meets the difficulty target, that is a proof essentially that they have expended a tremendous amount of energy to produce that, and they therefore are incentivized to present the transactions accurately. There's no reason that they would not do so because they risk losing that block reward. So I want to dig into that a little bit more. There's really three components of the Bitcoin network that come together in order to create the decentralization that can give us the confidence that we've solved that Byzantine general's problem, that we've actually allowed for peer-to-peer, counterparty risk-free transactions. The first that we've been focused on are the miners. And at the end of the day, the miners are contributing that proof of work. I often hear people say Bitcoin isn't backed by anything. It's fake, and I myself used to fall into that lack of understanding. So I'd like to just show a hash board from an actual mining machine, and the reason I think it's important is just to show that while this is all software and it is digitally native, there's a very real world component to what the miners are doing. And what we can see here is actually a string of chips, of application-specific integrated circuits that run that SHA-256 algorithm. And ultimately, this component goes into a computer. That's what Bitcoin miners are at the end of the day. They're computers, they're data centers. But the real world impact of that, or the answer to the question of what's backing Bitcoin, is the energy. This allows that energy to be transformed into SHA-256 computation, which ultimately yields the proof of work through the process that we've described. Energy, as we've learned in our physics classes, cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transferred. Energy is something that has universal value. It's really the most honest way to base a new form of confirmation of proof of work. I think it's really a much more effective way than extracting metal from the earth. And so keep that in mind when people mention that Bitcoin isn't backed by anything. So we have the miners contributing the proof of work, taking transactions in, adding a nonce, and trying to meet the difficulty target of the network. The question follows, though, why? I struggled with this for months, but why are the miners doing all of this? Well, once they've taken the transactions, they can broadcast to the network that they have found a nonce that meets that difficulty target. And the way ultimately that a miner gets that reward is through full nodes. Now, anybody can run a full node. I've got one here that I run. And there's tens of thousands of them. So it's very decentralized. And ultimately what a full node is just a record of fully validated transactions. And it's the participants in the network that validate those new transactions. In other words, when a miner broadcasts that block of transactions to the network, they have no control over whether or not it's accepted. The full nodes must all add that new block of transactions to the record of transactions. That is the blockchain, the chain of blocks, each one containing a list of transactions from sending and receiving addresses in the network. And so that creates a separation of function between the miners and the full nodes. And if you think about this, a miner is expending tremendous effort running these computers to try to find that winning proof of work. If they were to broadcast a bunch of fraudulent transactions trying to steal Bitcoin to the network, the full nodes would reject that block, and the miner would not receive the block reward, and all of those efforts would be lost. Now, perhaps in the earlier days of Bitcoin, there was more vulnerability when a small number of full nodes running on the network perhaps could have been fooled by a dishonest miner. But today, there are so many nodes running, tens of thousands all around the world, that it is functionally impossible for a miner to try to create a fraudulent double spend within a block they're mining and not have the network of full nodes reject it, thereby enforcing a very real world cost to their effort to undermine the network. And then finally, in this three-part representation of the network, we have the asset holders. And what I have here is a hardware wallet. And all this is a device that generates a public address and private keys to use that public address for Bitcoin, for the Bitcoin network. And an important concept to understand here is that the asset holders, that is, the owners of Bitcoin, have no influence on the consensus or the validation of the transactions. So this is a critical, again, a way to decentralize the control over the network. It's also open to anyone. It's open source software, and if you don't have a hardware wallet, there's all kinds of free ones that exist on the internet as well. But the important thing to understand is that this creates a decentralized network with three different key constituencies. Of course, you could be a miner, run a full node, and also be an asset holder, but you would not have any more rights than any other person that participates more or less in these components. This is the decentralization of Bitcoin, and it's really the underlying reason that the miners contribute that proof of work, is to remove control over consensus of transactions from asset holders or centralized management teams or whatever it may be that would create would undermine the ability of the Bitcoin network to solve the Byzantine generals problem, to remove that counterparty risk. Now I want to transition to talking about the energy industry. That's how I started in Bitcoin. That's really what brought me in, is I thought about it from the standpoint of an energy professional. And I really came from that standpoint of thinking, why are we expending this energy if we don't have to, if we don't get anything from it? Well, first, I hope by now we can realize that the energy is required, in fact, to enforce and create the decentralization of the network. The decentralization of Bitcoin is what eliminates counterparty risk and enforces the perfect scarcity of Bitcoin. And that's really the underlying value of this network. It's something that's available to all of humanity, and in my opinion, is a tremendously beneficial and positive use of energy. But even still, if Bitcoin miners are consuming a lot of energy, it's a valid concern to ask, well, what is the impact on our energy economy and on the availability of energy to citizens in our day-to-day lives? And this is where I think Bitcoin really shines and changes the whole way that we think about energy. And the way I describe it is there is no stranded energy. I mentioned before I worked at an oil and gas company and had firsthand experience of the struggles of being unable to get natural gas to market due to a lack of pipeline infrastructure. This is a very common issue encountered not just throughout Texas, but throughout the world. And I have an image here of a flare stack of natural gas just being burned off, just wasted energy. And I have firsthand seen really the remarkable opportunity in Bitcoin miners being able to monetize that energy. Basically, a Bitcoin miner can bring these high performance computers that are contributing that SHA-256 to the network and come right up to the wellhead. So there's no need for a pipeline. They go to where the energy is. And by running that natural gas through a generator, it's converted to electricity. The electricity is then used to run the computers, which generate the SHA-256 hash rate, and now take that energy and convert it into a real opportunity for jobs and bringing commercial use to a resource that otherwise was completely wasted. This has tremendous impact on our opportunity to think about how we bring energy to market, the value chain of energy, and decisions around how we develop our resources. I think we're really just scratching the surface right now about the implications for the oil and gas industry of using Bitcoin mining and high performance computing at large to really optimize assets and to bring more opportunities to rural communities that are living close to those resources. There's also a picture here of the ERCOT grid. ERCOT is the grid operator for most of Texas and publish prices for anybody to see. And what's remarkable about this representation and the use of colors is that anything in blue represents a negative power price. And when I first saw this, I thought that's not possible. It doesn't make any sense that somebody would pay an off-taker to use the power, that basically energy could be freer than free. And the way that this has really happened is if you look at the map, most of the deep blue where prices go negative are in far west Texas. These are largely rural areas where there are not demand centers from the large cities. In addition to that, in West Texas, there's a lot of wind and solar. And federal incentives have led to the overdevelopment of some of those wind and solar resources. And so particularly on a windy day, it's very common, if not the expected outcome, that power prices throughout West Texas are negative. And at the end of the day, what's driving that is a lack of transmission infrastructure. The transmission is what we need to move that power from far West Texas to the DFW Metroplex or Austin or Houston. And transmission takes a lot longer to build out than a solar farm. And so this issue isn't going away anytime soon. In fact, it's really getting it's increasing in its intensity. I can give a testimony of a particular experience that's always stuck with me. I drove about 5 hours from my home in Dallas out into West Texas. And the further you drive, the less and less buildings and people you see. And increasingly, all you see by the highway are pump jacks from the oil field and windmills. And I turned off the highway and I started to notice that more and more of the windmills were curtailed. They were sitting there still. And the reason for that wasn't that the windmill was malfunctioning or had broken or anything like that. There just wasn't enough transmission infrastructure. And so the prices had gone negative in that area. And the substation there could not handle any more power. And so these windmills just have to be completely stopped, curtailed, completely wasted. And so in addition to this negative power price, you have just lost energy entirely. And what was striking is as I approached the substation, right next to it was a Bitcoin mining facility being built to help support the economics of that investment, and ultimately to make the whole asset more efficient. And this is really a trend that I think will continue to increase and should make us all think a little bit more around the decisions we make in terms of how we manage our energy infrastructure and how this can be a tool to make it more efficient and to make all of us more prosperous by having increased energy abundance. This is a graph from the operator of the Texas grid, ERCOT, and it refers to a winter storm that occurred in December of 2022. And really, it was a quick and brutal freeze that led to a spike in market prices. And so what we can see here is a blue line of the consumption from large flexible loads. Large flexible loads are predominantly made up of Bitcoin miners in the Texas market, though this market is open, as it should be, to anybody who can be a flexible consumer of power in moments when other users of the grid require that energy. And what's really telling here is you can see the red line, which is the price in the market. And as that price spikes due to the freeze and the increase in energy consumption, there's a very clear response from these large flexible loads. And so this is a concept that really has to be combined with the prior slide. We have a lot of energy stranded or underutilized that we don't need except for a couple of days a year when it's either really cold or really hot. And while we have a decent idea of when it might be really cold, February, or when it might be really hot in July, we can never quite predict those weather events. So the question becomes, how do we better and more efficiently incentivize and support the build out of energy infrastructure that can have support year round from demand, but have that demand be flexible so that on those couple of days a year when we do need that power, we know it's going to be there for individual homes and schools and hospitals. This is what the large flexible load category in ERCOT is really all about. It's really the great value proposition of having Bitcoin miners participating in a grid. And here we have real data and a real life proof of concept of what this can do. And so often I'll hear people say, Bitcoin miners are competing with us for power. They're taking from grid consumers. Well, what we have to understand is on most days, there's plenty of power available. In fact, often, as the graph showed, there's too much. And assets are either sitting idle or driving prices even negative due to federal incentives. And so the energy scarcity is just not there most of the time. What's exacerbating the energy scarcity is our inability to utilize those assets during all the other times when the grid itself doesn't have an elevated level of demand. So I don't mean to say that we've solved this problem entirely. Bitcoin miners on a hot day in July probably make up less than 5% of the overall demand. In fact, they certainly make up less than 5%. But the solution to energy abundance and security is not less Bitcoin mining or less flexible load, it's more flexible load. And that's really a critical concept to understand, and that's represented here in this graph. I want to take a moment to talk about disruption of the energy industry. And this sequence of events here isn't intended to represent all of the disruption of the industry or only the best innovations, not at all. Really, the idea that I'd like to articulate here is that there have been numerous times throughout the history of the energy industry where some inflection point arrives, relatively unexpected. And there's kind of a before and an after. There's really no turning back after a certain advancement. And the impact of that advancement is really unimaginable to the people living then. The first one, really perhaps the most impactful, was the Spindletop well in 1901 in Texas. Before the oil boom that ensued after that Spindletop well, Texas was a largely rural state, more focused on agriculture, and the largest city in the state was Galveston. After this boom, there was really no turning back, and of course, the largest city in Texas today is Houston, and Houston is the energy capital of the world, and in large part, that is really traced back to that Spindletop well that really proved the tremendous resource under the ground here in Texas and attracted so many people to come to Texas. A few years after that well, with the advent of the internal combustion engine, there was absolutely nobody advocating that we return to using whale oil or traveling by horseback. But only a few years prior, it would have been unimaginable to even propose something like that. And so it's important to reflect back on the nature of these inflection points when something as transformative as the discovery of oil at scale came into the market. Another example that I think is useful is the advent of nuclear energy. The advancement around nuclear as an energy source really started during World War II. You fast forward a couple of years to 1954 with the first nuclear power plant. And of course, today, nuclear energy is used in many countries around the world, but has really mended or connected energy infrastructure, energy production with much larger and more complex geopolitical issues. Prior to nuclear energy, it really would have been unthinkable to contemplate such density in energy production, but also the risks that it could potentially propose. And so we still grapple with those today. And I think it's something that is fundamental to understanding the energy industry. So again, it really marks a point in time that the way a society would look at providing energy abundance and prosperity is different before nuclear energy and after nuclear energy. Another example that hits closer to home here in Texas is the advent of unconventional oil and gas development. And I got to see this firsthand. I can certainly remember, and many of you will as well, that there was a time when it was considered to just be a foregone conclusion that U.S. oil and gas production was on the decline and would continue to decline, and that we as a society would just be completely dependent on imports. And for years, experimentation had taken place in using horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing to try to access the oil and gas trapped in tight rock in formations that had never been able to be produced commercially. Many people failed, and a lot of money was lost in the endeavor to try to crack that issue. But by the late 90s, an approach emerged here in Texas by a company called Mitchell Energy of combining those technologies, and proved in the Barnett Shale just outside of Fort Worth that it could in fact work. And what seemed to have been impossible or ridiculous beforehand all of a sudden was proven to be applicable to reservoirs across the world. In the ensuing years, the narrative that the U.S. was going to be dependent on imports just completely disappeared, and now we take it for granted that we're an oil exporting country. And that's really, in the span of 20 years, a tremendous turnaround due to technological advancement that prior to the commercialization of that technology would have seemed really ludicrous. And so finally we come to the introduction of Bitcoin in 2009, and really Bitcoin hasn't been implemented at scale within the US economy. It really didn't start until 2021, is when we had publicly traded companies and large investment in Bitcoin mining infrastructure in Texas and across the country, really. So this is extremely new, but Bitcoin itself, of course, was introduced in 2009. What makes Bitcoin so different, though, and so unique, is that as a location agnostic flexible demand, it is the first evolution in the demand side of the equation. Really, the evolution in energy technology up until now has been around people trying to figure out how to produce more energy, cheaper, more efficiently, denser, or easier to transport. And that makes a lot of sense. Nobody had really approached the other side of this equation, the demand side. Ultimately, demand has always gone up and has been driven by wherever population centers are. And then within those population centers, it's largely driven by the weather. It's driven by air conditioning and heating connected to extreme weather events. And this has just kind of been the status quo. You can't control that. And so we have to plan for infrastructure on the supply side to meet that demand. Bitcoin's the first time that completely turns that equation on its head. Now we have flexible demand. It can go wherever we need it, and the network is growing more and more every day. So as an energy professional, I really had to ask myself, can you claim to be an energy professional and understand how transformative that location agnostic demand can be, and not continue to go down that line of inquiry? And of course, my answer is no. I think that the implications of Bitcoin to the energy industry, and particularly to an energy-centric state like Texas, are only beginning to be seen. And we will continue to see tremendous advancement in this industry because it's so new and has really not received a lot of attention. I don't want to misrepresent that there isn't anything going on. In fact, there's a lot of great advancements that have taken place in recent years through the efforts of Texas Blockchain Council and some of the collaborations that we've had. And I'm really excited to highlight a few as examples of really the level of institutional engagement that Bitcoin is starting to get, and the bright future ahead of us as we continue to research and highlight the benefits for society that this technology brings. The city of Fort Worth was the first city, the first government entity in the United States to mine Bitcoin. And we were so proud to be a part of that, and really commend the city of Fort Worth for being a center of innovation and really showing the vision to see that this is a tremendous opportunity and embracing that. Dallas College has partnered with the Texas Blockchain Council to develop a certificate focused on digital assets and cryptocurrency and blockchain technology. And Texas Blockchain Council has donated a Bitcoin mining machine to help train the workforce of tomorrow and to get hands-on experience for students and for the public at large, really. And that program has tremendous potential. Texas State Technical College is one of the largest workforce development entities really in the country, and is very influential within Texas of helping us build the workforce for tomorrow. Through a collaboration, we were able to recently launch a certificate through Texas State Technical College for technicians, which are desperately needed in many Bitcoin mining facilities that are bringing jobs to rural communities, but often struggle to hire people. And it's a great positive story of bringing these technical skills of high performance computing and data center management to rural communities. And we look forward to continuing to expand that program. TCU in Fort Worth co-hosted an event with the Texas Blockchain Council that was a great success. And in fact, this very presentation was first given at that event. And we really commend TCU for being a leading force in research and in the and really leveraging its history as a major energy school and a provider of energy professionals to the industry to incorporate Bitcoin mining as something that energy professionals should start to understand. We look forward to working with TCU to create a Bitcoin-denominated fund where students will be able to learn how to custody Bitcoin firsthand and interact with the technology directly. And it's really a novel and innovative way to bring that opportunity to students. And then Texas A&M University is one of the largest research universities in the world. And is really a leader in research related to the ERCOT grid. And I commend the university for launching a Blockchain and Energy Institute. We have donated 2 mining machines so far to Texas A&M, and we'll be expanding that collaboration so that more mining can be happening on campus where students can interact with it, and more research can be done around how we leverage this tool, this opportunity, to improve grid resilience and energy abundance for all. And there's a lot more to come there. These are just a few examples of some of the tremendous work that's being done and engagement from institutions, and it will certainly continue to increase. I want to focus now on kind of the philosophical alignment of Bitcoin with fundamental American principles. And at the end of the day, what Bitcoin is really addressing is the issue of centralization of power versus decentralization and empowering individuals. It's worth highlighting that the founding fathers were well aware of this when authoring the United States Constitution. And in fact, in Article 1, Section 10 make clear that no state shall enter into any treaty or make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. Now, of course, at the time of the U.S. Constitution, the best way to ensure decentralization was through the use of gold and silver. But the concept remains the same, that the concern of the writers here of the Constitution was to ensure that the state did not have a way to enforce or to censor its citizens through control of the money supply. And many of them had lived through the struggles of inflation throughout the Revolutionary War, where there were numerous paper monies being printed. So I think it's important to reflect that while for us it may seem perfectly normal to use this piece of paper, not long ago in the history of the United States, that wasn't the case at all. And in fact, there was specific attention given to the intention to prevent that. So finally, I want to reflect on President Andrew Jackson, whose image is on this $20 bill, and on the history of central banking in the United States. Not long after the Constitution was ratified, there were efforts successfully to create a Bank of the United States. That charter was not renewed, and a new battle began politically that resulted in a second Bank of the United States, receiving a charter in the early 1800s. That charter came up for review during the time of President Andrew Jackson's administration, and he was very focused on this issue. And while the renewal of the charter passed the Congress, one of the most historic moments in his presidency was his veto of the charter for the second Bank of the United States. And I think it's important to reflect back on that and to listen to the words of President Andrew Jackson. And I'll read from that very veto message. It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Distinctions in society will always exist under every government. Equality of talents, of education, or of wealth cannot be produced by human institutions. In the full enjoyment of the gifts of heaven and the fruits of superior industry, economy, and virtue, every man is equally entitled to protection by law. But when the laws undertake to add to these natural and just advantages artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. There are no necessary evils in government. Its evils exist only in its abuses. If it would confine itself to equal protection, and, as heaven does its rains, shower its favors alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. In the act before me there seems to be a wide and unnecessary departure from these just principles. These words were spoken many years ago, but they deal with the same central issue that this whole presentation is dealt with. It's about the individual and the risks that we incur in transacting with each other. Ultimately, it's about who should have control. The desire of the founders of this country and the words here of Andrew Jackson were that the people should control, that transactions should be peer-to-peer. And that's exactly what Bitcoin is. It's a peer-to-peer network. I think it's important that we all reflect on what that means in our current society. We have a choice. We can either lead or we can follow on this. Once presented with the simple facts of what Bitcoin offers to us, we can either evolve or we can choose to live in willful ignorance. I grappled with this myself for over 2 years before realizing that this is something I needed to pay attention to. I needed to spend more time reading about, and I felt the need to engage with others and promote its many benefits. I encourage you to do the same, for if we fail to learn from history, we are surely doomed to repeat it. Thanks for taking the time to explore the important implications of Bitcoin mining. Please join us for the summit presented by the Texas Blockchain Council this year in November in Fort Worth, Texas, for the most important professional networking event for this industry. There'll be a link with more information in the description, and I look forward to seeing you there.